How do you run software on your home server? If that's a question you're asking yourself, you're in the right place. In this video, we're going to be talking about Docker and Docker Compose and getting you started quickly. My name is Tenevin, and welcome to my channel, Tenevin Tech. I have a dream of helping families create their own home servers so they can capitalize on that new rise on open source software that is going to be enabled by AI, making programming very cheap. When starting a home server for the first time, it can be confusing to know where to start, especially if you don't have a technical background. I'm going to assume at this point that you have already selected hardware for your home server. If you haven't, please go out and check my video on hardware you should be looking at as a very beginner for home servers. The first thing you must understand when trying to run a home server on your own is how to get software to actually run on your server. In many cases, many people will just install applications directly on the host machine, and that's fine. In fact, that's how a lot of us will do it on our personal computers every day. But with home servers, it might be a little bit different because there's so many different applications to use that a lot of them can have their own website front ends. What if they use different technologies? For example, we can say we have two different applications. They both have a website front end, but they use different versions of Node. That's a problem because your computer cannot run multiple versions of Node or have multiple versions installed at the same time. So how do we fix this? The solution is to run your applications using Docker with Docker Compose or with Kubernetes. These technologies were specifically designed to allow applications to be run within their own isolated environments called containers. And this allows you to install as many applications as you need and have all of their dependencies and versions all self-contained within that container. And it also means you're not going to have a lot of installations on the host system itself. In this video, we're going to be focusing specifically on Docker and Docker Compose, not Kubernetes. I would love to make some videos on Kubernetes in the future. However, I myself am still learning how to do it, and I don't know if I have the confidence to really teach you guys how to do that yet. Anyhow, let's dive in. So what is Docker? When most people refer to Docker, they're talking about the Docker engine and everything else built on top of it. According to their main website, Docker Engine is an open source containerization technology for building and containerizing your applications. So then how is that different from Docker Compose? According to their main website, Docker Compose is a tool for defining and running multi-container applications. It is the key to unlocking a streamlined and efficient development and deployment experience. The difference is that Docker Compose allows you to define all of your applications in advance using YAML configuration files. And it does more than just one at a time. The best thing that I like about Docker Compose is you can define your entire stack, all written out in a defined manner, and all you have to do is do Docker Compose up, and all of your things will come up together, assuming you've configured them correctly. Another benefit of using Docker Compose is that it can help you run your applications on your home server consistently. You won't have to always go in and type in Docker run for every single container after a reboot or after you lose power. This stuff will allow you to run it in a single command, if at all, because I found when I run Docker Compose on my server, it will automatically restart all of my services when I reboot because I have configured them to do so. So at this point, now that we know what Docker and Docker Compose is, let's dive in to see how we can get this installed on our home server and begin working with it. I'm going to dive into installing it and how to get up your first couple of containers using Docker Compose. So the first thing we have to worry about is getting Docker installed on our home servers. Now we can do this with several different methods. The one way we can do is just the standard sudo apt get and sudo apt install for Docker and all of its little individual pieces. Like for example, I know there is a Docker and there's a Docker Compose and several other expansions that you can put in there, but that's a lot to remember. So what Docker has done is they've actually put together a script that allows us to install everything all at once in a single command. And this is how we do it. When we run this, it's going to install every single dependency you need to get Docker running. When I run it, it says that it's already been installed on my machine because I did do this in advance. I'm going to do Control-C because it's already there. When it's done running on your machine, you can test to make sure it's actually operating by doing docker -- version. And this will show you what version you have installed with Docker. If it didn't work, it's going to throw an error instead. Let's try doing a Docker run command. So we'll do Docker run, and I'm going to do the simple one that they've provided us, which is hello world. Now this container is specifically designed to only print out a single result and then immediately stop, which is perfect for our testing scenario. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. And as you can see at the very top, it says hello from Docker, and then a whole bunch of other information about it. But we're not really here just to set up and run a single Docker image. We want to run a whole bunch of them together. And because I plan on expanding this in the future, I want to do this in a way that's very nicely organized that I can expand in the future without it becoming overwhelming. So let's start by creating a new directory. So for me, I've already done so, and I've created this directory called Docker, and that's where we're going to be going into today. If you don't have that directory there, you can use the make directory command and then give it a name. This is the command that I use to create that folder. But since it's already created for me, I'm just going to go ahead and change directory into that folder so we can get started. In order for Docker Compose to work, you're going to need to have a Docker Compose YAML file at the root level you're planning to run it. For me, if I open up and look at this menu, there isn't any files here at the moment. So I'm going to be creating this from the beginning with you. I'm going to go ahead and clear off the screen. So now you're going to use the text editor of your choice to create a file and fill it with the following information. I like using Nano, but if you want, you can use Vi or Vim. Those work just as fine as well. So I'm going to use Nano, and I'm going to call this Docker with a hyphen compose.yml. When I get into here, it's going to allow me to start defining things. So I don't really intend for this high level Docker Compose YAML to actually have any containers in it. Instead, I want this one to kind of be the orchestrator. This one is just going to have references to the other Docker Compose files that I will have, because I plan on breaking them out and having one per every container or two. So this file, all it's going to include is the include tag. And I'm going to come down and I'm going to define the next thing in my system. I want to have a set of core services, one of which is going to be Portainer. But I'm going to have that in its own folder, and inside that folder, it will have its own Docker Compose YAML file. I'm also going to have a little bit of a front end that I can use, and I like to use for my home servers, is something called a homepage. And that also is going to be in its own folder and have a Docker Compose YAML file. And this is all I need to have on my high level Docker Compose YAML. All it's going to do is just bring in other ones so that I can have a nice and clean experience right here and have everything organized. And if I want to remove one of these from my stack, all I have to do is edit this file and comment out that include. And then I can run everything without that item on my stack. So I'm going to go ahead and save and exit. I'm going to go ahead and clear this off. And if I now take a look at the inside of this folder, we can now see that my Docker Compose was made. We are going to want an environment file here. And that's typically going to be just called .env. So I'm going to create another file here. This is going to be nano.env. Come into here, and all I really want to add to this one for testing purposes is a time zone. I'm going to make that short by using TZ. And I'm going to do it in a good old place, America, Denver. I'll go ahead and save and exit. Okay, so that was just the simple stuff up front. We now have our Docker Compose at the root level, and we have an environment file for it to pull environment variables from. Now we actually need to start adding some applications to our home server. Let's do that by creating a new folder for the application we want to start with. I want to start with Portainer. So I'm going to do make directory. I'm going to call it Portainer. And then I'm going to move into this new directory. Whoop. And now we're going to create a brand new Docker Compose file. Now that we're in here, we're going to be defining the configuration for Portainer. So here in this Docker file, we're going to define a services tag at the very top. And then we're going to create a service called Portainer. We want to make sure that we say the container name is Portainer. And we're going to define an image that will be running this application. Now, an image is like a prepackaged set of code and installations necessary to run this application. I'm not going to be covering in this video how we create these images, just that you are able to pull images and create applications out of it. In our case, I didn't make Portainer, but Portainer is available at this location. And I want to make sure I use the latest version of this image. Now notice that I put CE here. That's for the community edition of Portainer. If you happen to be purchasing the business edition, you're going to be using EE instead, which is for enterprise edition. But I like the free version stuff, and I'm sure you guys will too. So next we need to find the ports of where this is going, or I'm going to be able to access this after it's running. So I'm going to define this, and I'm going to say I want this application to be available at port 9000. And on the internal side, it's going to map to 9000. So this is a very interesting thing you guys should know. With ports, we define two. The one on the left is going to define the external way to access this application. And the one on the right is what that is mapped to on the inside. Now the application portainer is expecting requests to come in on port 9000. But what if 9000 is already taken our home server? Well, then we can just change the exterior one to 9100, and then it will still work just fine. We can just send requests to 9100, and that will be mapped to 9000 internally in this container. But for now, we're not really worried about ports, so I'm going to switch that back to 9000. The next thing we have to figure out and have to add to this is volumes. So I'm first going to be adding what's called a named volume. I'm just going to call portainer data. And I'm going to map it to the internal file system at the folder data. Now, volumes are used to ensure that when we turn off the application and turn it back on again, the data will persist, because we don't want to have to reconfigure it or have to create our new admin account again. We want to have all this data be consistent every single time. Now, there is one special thing that portainer needs, and that is access to the Docker socket. Now, I'm going to go ahead and get the path of the Docker socket. I'm going to map it to the internal directory that's very similar inside of portainer. This is actually needed for portainer because it accesses the Docker socket to be able to look at containers and manipulate them. Now, before I move on, I'm actually going to finish the other half of this named volume. So I need to create another top level label here that will be volumes, if I can spell it right. Yep. And I'm going to put here portainer data. Now, I don't have to put anything else in here. This is just telling Docker that this is supposed to be a volume that needs to create and handle and run. But I don't have to define anything else other than that. All right, so the next we are going to be looking at is the restart policy. Remember how I mentioned in the past how when I reboot the computer, it will automatically restart my applications and systems. So that's what we're going to be defining here. Most of the time, what I like to use for the restart is just restart unless I have specifically chosen to stop it. So if the power goes out, it will restart. But if I go and I manually tell this container to stop or your Docker Compose down for the portainer, it will stop it and it's not going to come back. The very last thing I want to put on here is an environment variable. Remember how we defined that time zone variable? Well, portainer can actually use it. So I'm going to define the time zone variable that portainer is looking for, and I'm going to give it the time zone environment variable that I defined in our .env file. And this is it. This is everything we need in order to run portainer in a very simplistic form. So I'm going to go ahead and save, and I'm going to exit. And now I'm going to work on the next one. So let me clear this. Now I'm going to change directory and press 2 dots to go back to the Docker directory. Now we're going to make a new directory, and this one's going to be called homepage. Let's go ahead and create our Docker Compose file. And you notice I made that mistake there. I need to change directory into the homepage first. There we go. Now we're in the right directory. Now I can create a Docker Compose YAML file. So in here, we're going to start with the exact same top level tag, and this is services. This one I want to have to be my homepage application. I'm going to give it the container name of homepage, and I want the image. Next, I want to define the volumes that this is going to be using. Got to get that spacing right. So I'm going to map the local config folder, which doesn't exist right now, to the internal folder app config. I'm going to then create another one that's going to be another local folder called images, which also doesn't exist yet, to app public images. I'm going to do the same thing with a folder called icons, mapping that one to app public icons. Then I want to put some environment variables on here. I also want to do a restart policy. Then I also need to define ports. All right, so that should be everything that we have here for our Docker Compose. So now it's for the moment of truth. I'm now going to go back into the root menu. Again, this is where we have our uppermost Docker Compose file, and it has the two folders, one called homepage and one called portainer. And if all goes well, this Docker Compose file should be reaching into the other two folders and starting both of those applications, even though they have their own Docker Compose files. In order to do this, all we need to do is type in the command docker compose up. But I like to do one more thing. I like to do a -d. What this means is you're running it detached. If I was to do this without -d, it will run it and then it will just keep a hold of my command line and do it until I type in Control-C, which will stop it all. But if I want to keep the command line, which most of the time I do, I'm just going to do Control-D and let it run in the background. And as you can see here, it says additional property volumes is not allowed. That's because I spelt it wrong. So let me go back and see if I can get that fixed. This is inside the portainer. Docker Compose YAML. So where did I misspell it? Right here. Let's fix that. Save and exit. And let's give that another try. There we go. So now it's pulling the images, and since I've actually used these before, the images are already pulled on my machine, and it started them up pretty quickly. So now what? They're running on your system, but now we need to have access to them. How do we get to them? Well, the first thing we need to have is we need to find the IP address of our home server. For me, it's a Raspberry Pi, and I have it connected via Ethernet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in ifconfig, and that will bring out a whole bunch of different things here. The one I'm looking for is the one that is by Ethernet, which is EF0. And that here I can see has a little INET value that says 192.168.12.85. That is the IP address of my Raspberry Pi. So I'm going to keep track of that. I'm going to copy it. And now we're going to take it over to our browser. 192.168.12.85. And then we want to go to 9000, which is what should be running our portainer. And here it says we're over here at portainer. So this is my first time using it. It's going to ask me to create a username and a password. Now it does have to be 12 characters long at the very minimum. So I'm just going to put a nice little test password in here. Assuming I spelled all that right. And we're going to create a user. Now that I'm here, I should be able to access everything for our portainer and our Docker. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I can see, oh look, we already have some containers running on here. If I look at this, it says this is my Docker stack. It says I have homepage and portainer running, and they can give me information about what the local IP address is within Docker, as well as give me a link to the other ports. So from here, I can just click on this port, and it will take me to the other page. But look, it got it wrong. It's because it doesn't know my Raspberry Pi's IP address. So I'm going to navigate to it. 192.168.12.85. If I navigate there, now I should be able to make it onto the home page. And here it is. So this is the default home page that I like to use for my home server, so I can link different services together all in one place. It makes it very easy, so I don't have to keep remembering the ports and everything for every service. I can just put it all on here in a configurable manner. And that is how you run Docker Compose on your home server, and you're able to access it from your machine. And that wraps up today's video about Docker and Docker Compose. We covered why it's important and how you can get started with it. I hope this was very helpful for you. So what have you discovered about Docker that is exciting to you? Have you noticed anything that I missed in this video? And my invitation to you is don't wait to get started. Getting started is the best way to learn. Even if it's something simple like Docker, you can experiment and try new things, and you'll find your knowledge expanding rapidly. And as always, if you like this video or the content I've made, please like and subscribe to this channel so you can receive more tech tips from me in the future.